Hey everyone, and welcome to my first tutorial on this channel. My name is Jack, and I'm a visual effects artist by trade, but game design is something that I've been teaching myself over the last couple of years in my spare time. For those of you who don't know, this channel is something that I'm using to document my progress as a game designer. The game that I'm building is a multiplayer arena shooter called Galaxy Grudge, and over time I'm hoping to do a bunch of tutorials to share some knowledge with everyone. I'll be doing tutorials on sounds, effects, materials, models, game mechanics, coding, and hopefully some other things. So today I'm going to be sharing a tutorial for a procedural material in Substance Designer that you can use for blood and guts. I'm going to be using this material for all of the bits and pieces that explode out of players in my game who get eviscerated by the weapons I'm designing. So at the end of this tutorial I will show you the final result, and then I'll show you what it looks like in my game. Alrighty, so let's jump over into Substance Designer and get started. Alrighty, so we're here in Substance Designer and we're just going to do a quick little amount of setup before we get started. So to set things up, we're just going to come to File, New Substance, and I'm just going to call this Blood and Guts. And everything else I'm going to leave as it is. It'll be a 2K texture, so that's good. These are the outputs that we're going to get, that's fine. Just going to hit OK. And then we get our 3D view, our 2D texture preview, and we get our node graph with our outputs. Awesome. So the way that I usually like to work in Substance is I like to do all of my my shapes and my geometry and my form first. So I'm usually working with normals and height to begin with, and then once I've got all of the shape defined, I'll go on and do the colors and the roughness and the metallic later on. You can work differently, that's just how I do things. So usually the way I like to work is I like to put a mid-gray on my base color. So I'm going to hit tab, I'm just going to go uniform color, plug that in here. I'm just going to do like a 50% gray. And then I don't want like a mirror finish on my roughness like this. I just want it to be a little bit rough. So I'm going to make another uniform color, plug that into my roughness, and just adjust the value a little bit. So it's just a little bit blurry. And this will sort of help us a little bit to see the shapes of everything that we're making. Okay, so the other thing that we need to do is we need to set up our material for showing displacement. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to make a Perlin noise, and we're going to plug this into our displacement channels to preview this. So I'm going to make a normal node, plug my Perlin noise into the normal. You can see the detail in here, and I'm going to adjust the intensity to something like 20, plug that into the normal, and then I'm also going to plug this Perlin into the height, and nothing happens in here, so we just have to change some settings. So I'm going to come up to my materials, default, definitions, and then this is the material we're using. We're just going to switch on tessellation, and I'm going to adjust the tessellation factor all the way up, and I'm going to increase the scale all the way up, and now we actually have our mesh being affected by the material. Awesome, so that's working, so cool. So yeah, we can get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start creating the sort of bits and pieces of, you know, intestines and gore and stuff. And we can actually start with a Perlin noise. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to scale this up so it's not so small. Something like that is probably okay. But you know, looking at this, you can sort of see it's all the details are kind of all the same size, and that's because of the way that the Perlin noise works. So what we're going to do is we're going to create some smaller details and blend them over the top of this. So I'm just going to copy this Perlin noise, paste it, and then I'm going to view this one, and I'm just going to scale it down a little bit so it's smaller, and then just randomize the pattern a little bit. And then what I'll do is I'll put a blend node up here, And I'll just drop this Perlin into the foreground. And then if we select this guy, I'm going to change the blending mode to something like soft light. And that'll sort of allow both levels of detail to come through. So you can sort of see we're getting, you know, a little bit more randomness, which is nice. So what I might do after that is blend in another one of these, a little bit smaller again. So I'll grab this Perlin noise here, copy it, paste it, add some more disorder, and then just shrink it down. And then I will add another blend node up here and add this over the top, soft light. And you can see what that's doing when we bring that in. But rather than bringing it in everywhere, I actually only want to bring it in certain places. And so the blend node has this opacity input, which is basically like, you know, you can provide it with an alpha channel, and that's what I'm going to do. So for my alpha channel, what I might do is just make a noise map. So what I might use is like a clouds 2 or something like that. I can scale that up, add some disorder to it, and then if we view that guy, what I might do is just blur this off a little bit with a blur HQ grayscale. Just blur it off like that, and then we're going to basically use this as our alpha. So I want the alpha to have a little bit more contrast. So what I'll do is I'll add a levels node, and I'll just crunch up some of this detail, something like that, and then plug that into the alpha here. And then if we view this node, you can sort of see what we're getting. We're getting those details coming through, but they're only coming through in a few little places. So yeah, that's a good starting point. And we can sort of come back and adjust this later. So, you know, right now when we look at this, you know, it doesn't really look like anything, right? It just looks like a bunch of, you know, wavy noise. And so basically we have to adjust the curvature between the white and the black values. And we're actually going to use a slope blur grayscale to do this. This is a really useful node. You can use it for lots of different things. The easiest thing that you can do with it is to just plug both inputs into your previous one, and then you get this craziness going on. So what I'm going to do is increase the samples all the way up, and you can sort of see what it's doing. You know, it's basically taking the curvature and it's sort of changing the way that we interpolate between those numbers. So, you know, I might put this at something like maybe 0.8. You know, that's kind of giving us some nice like randomness, kind of making these sort of like bulbous sort of shapes. Kind of looks like intestines. It's pretty disgusting, but that's cool. That's pretty much what we want. So yeah, slope blur grayscale, super helpful. So, you know, if we look at that now, we might think, oh, that looks pretty cool, let's move on. But I think there's actually some more things that we want to do to this. So we can sort of see if we zoom in here that we're getting a lot of like a lot of straight lines, and that's because our slope, our Perlin noise, you can sort of see when you add disorder to this that, you know, it's using like a grid pattern, and you know that sort of grid pattern, it's a little bit homogeneous, and it can sort of result in shapes that do look a bit samey. Like you can sort of see we have these vertical blobs here, we have these horizontal ones here. It doesn't look entirely random, so we want to add like a little bit more randomness into this. And there's a whole bunch of things that we can use to do this. What I would probably use here would be a like a vector warp grayscale, and we can sort of use this to take an input image and then just kind of like warp it and smudge it in various different directions. So the input that it takes, you can see here we have this red line, and that basically means that what you're plugging into this input is not, you know, it's not the correct format for the data. So I'm just going to alt click on that to remove that, and we have to create a vector map. And a vector map is basically like a 2-channel image merged into an RGB stream, and then we can plug that in. So let's do that. So what I might do is create a Clouds 3, something like that. I might scale it up a bit, and we actually need 2 of these because we need 1 for each vector channel. So I'll just copy this and paste it, and then this one here I'll just add some disorder, and now we have 2 completely different images. So after each of these, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to blur this a little bit and turn the quality up, turn the intensity down. We just want, something like this. Cool. So copy and paste, drop that down here. And then the way that we can merge these into an RGB stream is we can just hit tab and go RGBA merge. And that gives us 4 inputs, RGB and alpha. We just want to plug this one into the red and then plug this one into the green. And then if we view this, we're not getting anything, but that doesn't matter. The data is still in there, and we can just plug this into the vector warp. Now straight away, you can see as soon as you do that, that this all just goes completely crazy. So if we view this vector warp, we can sort of see what it's doing. So if we drag the intensity back down, we can kind of get an idea for what's going on. So it's basically just warping the entire image. And this is really cool just for sort of like breaking up patterns with a little bit of randomness. And we really don't need much, like we really don't need much at all. Like this is 0.02, so the difference between 0 and 0.02, it's very subtle, but it does just give you a nice little bit of randomness in here, and it kind of eliminates those straight lines. We just want to avoid anything that looks procedural and mathematical if we can. Okay, so that's not too bad. It's kind of looking pretty cool. But there is another thing that I would sort of like to do to this entire thing, and that would be to just add like a little bit of distortion into the base of these sort of shapes. So we have these like really clean lines, these recessions here, and it'd be nice to sort of just put like a little bit of noise in there just to make it a bit bumpy in those areas where the flesh is kind of ripped apart. So yeah, so let's do that. So I'm just going to drag these nodes back, and there's heaps of ways that we can do this. We could use another vector warp grayscale, and we could mask our result with something else. So, we could blend it over the top and use the height to sort of help avoid blending it in over these bumps. So, yeah, let's do something like that. So, what I might do is just create a Clouds 2, scale this up, add some disorder, and then after this vector warp grayscale, I'll make another one of these, and then I'll just copy this blur over. We'll use it for these clouds here, and we'll just come in and just reduce this intensity because we do want this to be pretty bumpy, and we do want small details. So I'll copy those, I'll paste another 2, and then I'll just take this cloud here and just add some disorder so it's different. Same again, RGB, we'll just merge this in, and then what we'll do is plug that in up here, and you can sort of see what it's doing. So it's creating all this bumpiness, and that's awesome. But really what we want to do is we only want to apply that bumpiness in these recesses. So what we can actually do is we can blend between this node here and this one, and we can use the alpha sort of fall off here to help us out. So if I put down a blend node and I make this guy here the background, and then this one here the foreground, and if I set this to soft light, and then plug this into the normal, plug this into the height, and you can sort of see what that's doing. So it's just adding like a little bit of variation to the image, which is cool. And you know, like we can change our intensity to add more, you know, so that's sort of adding some nice little bumps and stuff around those edges. That's pretty cool, pretty disgusting actually. And then what we can do is, you know, we can just use this original map here as an alpha. So, you know, what I can do is grab this guy here. I can grab a histogram scan. I can plug this in, and then I can use the position to essentially isolate those areas that we want to use to blend our distorted values in. So something like this, something like that. And then what I can do is I can just, you know, because we're using this as an alpha, we actually want these gaps here to be white and we want this to be black. So to flip an image, you can just grab a levels node and just flip the inputs. And that's just the same as, you know, inverting. And then what we can do is we can just plug that in here. And you can sort of see what that's doing. It's kind of adding distortion, but only in those regions. And to open that up to more regions, we can just come back to our histogram scan and we can just change the position. And you can see like there, it's sort of adding that distortion, but it's only adding it into the edges of our shapes. And if we reduce the contrast, it'll sort of, you know, blur nicely across the result, which is exactly what we want. Cool. So yeah, I'll just bring that back down here so it's a little bit less confusing. Bring this back here, bring this down a bit, bring these over. Might actually just put this up here so it's makes sense with the node a little bit more. Great. Okay, so this is, you know, like a pretty reasonable basis for our first bunch of giblets. So what I'm going to do is just select all of this stuff and just frame all of this. And I'm just going to call this main shapes. Great. And just drag this back. So that's looking pretty good. And we, you know, maybe later on we might come back and add some more bumps to this. We'll just see how it comes out. But that's looking pretty reasonable for now. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to put some veins over the top of all of this stuff. And again, we're just going to add a blend node to blend these veins over. Bring the opacity down so we can see our pattern. And the veins, we're actually going to use a procedural substance node called a scratches generator. And when we make that, you can sort of see what it is. It's basically just making a whole bunch of little squiggly lines. And then we're going to use these lines and we're going to distort them, and these are going to be our veins. So this node has quite a few parameters. We can use this spline number to increase the number of splines that we have. We can change the max segments so that the curvature is smoother. We can randomize the rotation of these splines. We can scale the splines up, make them longer. Spline distortion, we can increase that to, you know, put noise through them and make them a little bit wavy. We can change the frequency and the randomness of that distortion. Bring the frequency down so that they're not so distorted like this. There's lots of things that we can do, which is cool. Spline width, you know, make them thicker. That can be helpful. And then down here at the end we have this fade mode, and at the end, like, these are basically fading off from start to finish, but I want them to fade on both ends because I don't want hard ends for these veins. And the fade length, I'll probably just squash that down a little bit so that our veins are kind of chunkier for most of their size. Luminance random is helpful as well. That'll basically add different veins of different brightness. which is cool because it'll make some of them like more prominent than other ones. So so that's cool, but what I would probably do is add some extra distortion to these, because the distortion that we get with this base node is just not really quite what we want for veins. So again, I would probably use either a vector warp grayscale or even like a directional warp, and maybe we can use one of those because we haven't used those yet. The only thing about directional warps is that they only warp in one axis. You can see the angle here, whereas the vector ones can do two axes. So if you're going to use a directional warp, you usually have to do one warp in one angle and then another one 90 degrees from that first angle, so that you get warping in all axes. And that's that's a little bit of extra work, but it can be good if you want to separate the warping differently per sort of direction. So yeah, maybe I'll just use the vector warp because that's a little bit more efficient. So we use this guy, and then for our warping, what I might just use is a Perlin noise, and we do want this to be pretty small. We want these details to be pretty small for the warping of these veins. So we'll just use two of these guys, same as before. We don't need to blur this because Perlin noise is already blurred, so we can just merge these together, our red and our green, plug these in here, and then again, like you can sort of see, it goes pretty crazy. We can just reduce that, and then straight away we're getting some really interesting, nice kind of like veiny shapes, which is really cool. And I might just make this a bit bigger so we can see it. And what can also be cool is, like, now that we've put that distortion in there, grab your scratches generator and just play with the random seed until you get a pattern that feels pretty reasonable, that feels quite veiny. Some of the seed values can produce really interesting results. Some of them can also result in like sort of straight lines, and that's possibly because of the way that the Perlin noise works. This one feels pretty good. I don't mind that, actually. I kind of like that. So before we drop these veins over the top of our shapes, we probably want to just remove some of them, because we don't want veins everywhere. We want them to be on some spots but not others. So what I might do is just add another Perlin noise, and we'll make this quite big, and this is basically just going to be a map that'll allow us to, the white places are going to be where our veins will show, and the black places are going to be where the veins won't show. So maybe we do something like this, maybe a little bit more like this perhaps, and then what we can do is we can just blend these together, and in order to use this Perlin noise to block out some of these veins, we can just set the blending mode to multiply, and you can see what that did. But it can be also helpful to clamp this a little bit, just to crunch these values so that the transition from bright to dark is a little bit shorter. So yeah, like something like that can be a little bit better. And then I might just play with this noise, this levels a little bit, just to bring some more of that back in. Something like that. That feels pretty good. Cool. And I might just quickly save this before I lose all my work. Awesome. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take these veins and I'm going to blend them over the top of what we already have. So add a blend node here, and these veins are going to be our foreground. And you can see that that's totally busted, because what we actually want to do is we just want to add these white values just over the top of everything else. So we change the blending mode to add, and that's still busted because they're super bright. So we're just going to bring this opacity like right down until those veins feel like they're just on the surface of our blobs. You know, so something like that. That feels pretty good. That's not too bad. But when we zoom in on these veins, you can see that we sort of have this this kind of triangle angular shape going on, and we can fix that just by coming back to our veins and just adding another one of those blur high quality grayscale nodes, and we just increase the quality and bring the intensity down until those veins start to feel like they're actually veins. So yeah, something like that probably works a little bit better. That's not too bad. Okay, well, we can come back and adjust that later if we feel like we want to, but for now we can just say that that's good enough to move on to the next thing. So I'm going to frame those, call that veins, and that looks good enough for now. Okay, so the next thing I would probably want to do to this is, you know, if these are all sort of like pieces of blood and guts, we really want to sort of feel like there's little, you know, pools of blood kind of in the surface here, and it'll help to sort of break up the color later on. So, you know, if we think about what our black and white image is doing in terms of our height, the darkest areas are the deepest recesses. So essentially what we want to do is we basically want to say, well, you know, at a certain darkness value, we just have, you know, if it's lower than that, we just clamp it all to the same value so that we can turn these recesses into just like flat areas. And there's a really simple node that we can use to do that, and it's called clamp. So you'll start to see what happens with this clamp node. If we raise this min value, you can sort of see what it's doing. Like it brings those low values up and it flattens them out, and it looks like, you know, little pools of blood, which is great. So if we rotate our light around, we can see those. That's pretty awesome. Maybe we go a little bit higher so that we can see a little bit more. And we're not getting many of those pools down here in this bottom left. So maybe we can come back to our Perlin noise that we made at the start, and we can just add some disorder to that, just to change some of our patterns a little bit. That is disgusting. That's great. So yeah, we're getting like reasonable coverage all the way across our setup. And also what I might do is just come back to my slope blur grayscale, and I might just bring this down to like 0.7 just to make it a little bit rounder and not so flat, because you can sort of see what happens when you bring this intensity up. It like really flattens out all that detail. So, you know, you really want to find a sweet spot where it starts to look flat enough that it has shape and form, but not so flat that it just looks, you know, mathematical. So something like that is not too bad. That's reasonable. I don't mind that. And in fact, on this blend node here, I wonder if we might get a better result if we used a copy node and we blended in some of these shapes a little bit differently. Maybe something like that, perhaps. We are using a pretty crunchy alpha, so if we crunch that up even more, then the copy algorithm will probably give us a slightly more interesting result. you can just see like you're getting these nice little small bits breaking up all the larger pieces. And I don't mind that actually. I kind of like that. That's looking a little bit less mathematical and a little bit more interesting. Nice. And then what I might be able to do is just come to my clamp node, just increase this min value, and then we're getting some nice like pools of blood, which are, that feels like it's working pretty nicely. Awesome. Now, if we come down to our pools of blood, we can see that, because of what the clamp node is doing, it basically, as soon as you get to a certain level of brightness, it just flattens everything. And that's leading to this really hard edge here, where these flattened blood areas meet the edges of our blobs. And we don't really want that. Like, what we want is sort of like, like when you have like a liquid in a glass and around the edges, it sort of curves upwards. The liquid sort of curves toward the glass. We want to mimic that here. And we can actually do that using a blur node. So if we put a blur HQ grayscale in here, up the quality, and then reduce the intensity, you can sort of see here on these edges, like what that's doing. So that's giving us that sort of smooth interpolation from flat to the edges. But then, if we blur the entire thing, you can see that it blurs everything. Like, it blurs off all of our nice details that we had in here before, right? And we don't want to lose that detail. So essentially what we want to do is we want to blend between this clamped version and then this blurred version, and we only want to show through the blurred version where these pools of blood are. So what we can do is we can make a blend node after this grayscale, and we want the background to be this clamp, and then we want the foreground to be this blurred version, and then we need to make an alpha that represents these pools of blood only, so that we can tell Substance that we only want the blurred value in these pools of blood and around these edges. So what we can do again is we can use a histogram scan, and we want to create an image where these pools of blood are white. So change our position here and up our contrast, and that's basically what we're getting. So let's go find this shape that we're on over here. So that's this shape here. And yeah, so we can sort of crunch this in, something like that. Yeah, so that's sort of like roughly where we're at. And then, we can take this histogram scan, we can add a level to it to flip it, to make those blood shapes white, and then we can just plug that in here, and then you can sort of see what that's doing. Like if we take this histogram scan and we move this position, you can sort of see, I don't know if you can see that on the stream, but you can sort of see how it's raising the area where the blur is allowed to happen. And so, we just want it to happen. We want to sort of blend between those pools of blood and those edges, and we can bring down the contrast to sort of increase the area where we blend between the blur and not, to something like that. And that's like nice and clean. So that's, we're getting that nice kind of meniscus on the edge of our blood, but we're also retaining all of the detail on the shapes that we've already made. And that's working. That's really cool. Nice one. So I'll just grab those nodes, frame that. That's going to be our blood pools. Okay. So the last thing I would do, actually I'm going to get rid of this blend node because we don't want that. I'll just plug that straight into my normal and my height. The last thing we want to do is we want to increase the dynamic range of our image. Because we used that clamp node over here, we've basically cut out almost a third of our detail, because we've basically said anything below 0.3 is just going to be flattened. So what we essentially want to do is we want to refit the data that we have between 0.3 and 1. We want to fit that back to 0 and 1 so that we keep all of our dynamic range for our texturing. And we can actually just use an auto levels to do that. So after we add the auto levels back in, all of our sort of displacement and normal information gets crunched, gets opened up all the way back to black and white. You can see the difference between the clamp and this one. And then, we can probably come back to our slope blur grayscale here, just to adjust that, if we want to change anything slightly. I think that's pretty good. And I might just play a little bit with some of these parameters here. Just maybe see if we can come up with some slightly more interesting shapes. Kind of like that actually, because we have these sort of nice big shapes in here, but then these smaller ones. And then maybe here, like I can push some of those smaller details out a little bit, just so we don't have as much coming through. Maybe we can change some of this scale slightly. Gives us a little bit of interesting stuff going on. Yeah, I mean, you can kind of play with this to your heart's content. I really like sort of messing with these values and just sort of coming up with new designs on the fly and seeing how, all the logic that you've built can create slightly different results. It's really, really cool. It's like a super powerful thing about Designer. All right, so, let's say that for now, this is sort of pretty reasonable, and we can go on to start creating some color detail. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to our auto levels, and if we look at our levels here, what we really want is we want sort of like a dark blood in these puddles, and then as we get higher we want to blend into some mid-red colors, and then we want to finish at the top with sort of like a fleshy light pinky orangey color. So yeah, so we can just do that with a gradient map. So I'm going to drop it my height in here, and then I'm going to go gradient editor, and we're just going to start adding some colors by clicking on our swatches here. So the first color I'll do, sort of like a dark blood color, and then maybe up here at the top we'll do sort of like a a pinky desaturated color. In here, what I might do is blend into like a slightly more saturated red, something like that. And then up here, I might just sort of keep that pink, but then just rotate this top color into a slightly more fleshy salmon pink color, something like that. All right. And then what I'll do is I'll just, drag that into my base color and just see what we get. Cool. So, for a first pass, that's not too bad. Maybe I'll come back into my gradient editor, maybe bring this fleshy pink down a little bit so we see a little bit more of it on our gizzards, make it, just gives a little bit more contrast between these areas here and these areas here. That's pretty disgusting, which is what we're going for. So that's pretty cool. I don't mind that. I wouldn't mind actually creating some breakup in this color though, because this is just like super smooth from dark to light, and really what we want is a little bit of interesting design going on in here. So let's do that. Okay, so in order to sort of create some variation in this color map, what I might do is I'll just create a really simple procedural sort of overlay. I'll just create like a clouds, and I'll blur that off slightly, a little bit, and then I'll just do a slope blur on this, that's going to create something along those lines. We can actually sort of, we can sort of randomize this pattern a little bit, or we can flip it, invert it, and then just throw it over the top. So let's just see what we get here. So this is kind of looking almost like veiny, which is pretty cool. So let's make a gradient map, and I'll make the dark colors like a bright red, and I'll make the light colors like a dark color like that. So that this is kind of like a weird sort of like veiny, reddy broken up color, and we can just add this over the top, and maybe we use like an overlay color, almost like maybe we screen this over the top. So I'll go here, I'll go to screen, add that over the top like that. And you can sort of see that this is sort of not crunchy enough, like there's not enough detail in this. So maybe we come over here to our levels and we just make this result more contrasty. Something like that, maybe. And maybe we come into our gradient map, and instead of using like a hot red here, we can sort of use like a desaturated sort of a color. Maybe we come off the red a little bit and we make it a little bit more sort of orangey, perhaps. Something like that. And then, we can probably actually uncrunch this a little bit. Something like this. I mean, that's not terrible. But then what I would probably do is just come back to our blend and just reduce the amount that this is being blended over the top. Maybe something like that. And that pattern is kind of interesting, but what we could probably do is warp that pattern a little bit as well. So, before we gradient mapped this, we had this slope. Maybe what we could do again is just add a vector warp grayscale in here. And then, like we did before, we had these inputs. So, we can just come and copy something like that and, bring it up here. And we can maybe plug something else into it to make it a little bit more interesting. So if we come to our vector warp, bring our intensity down and just have a look at what this is doing. Yeah, so something like that. That's like a little bit fleshy, kind of veiny, pretty gross. Something like that. And that's nice. That just gives like just a little bit of like randomness, a little bit of like slightly meaty, like a meaty look to it. So that's not too bad actually. I don't mind that. I mean, again, we can come back and adjust this later, but let's just leave that for now. So I'll just frame that, and I'll just call this meaty pattern. Awesome. And I guess the next thing I would probably do is, we want to add, actually, that's an important thing. You can see here that we've added that meaty pattern, and it's gone over the top of our blood, and we actually don't want that. We only want it to go where our meaty bits are. So back here with our blood pools, we had this alpha here, and this is actually a really handy alpha. If we plug that into this blend node, there we go. That meaty pattern disappears from our blood, and it's only being screened over the top of our meat. So that's great. Okay, and I might just clean up these lines a little bit. Just keep this a little bit easier to look at. Great. Okay. So yeah, the next thing that I would probably want to do with this is to add some sort of like, like blood splatter, because we have these pools of blood here, and you would expect that if there's kind of like blood here, that it would be sort of slopping around and splashing on these chunks. So we want to add that in to give some extra believability here. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to use the height result from all of our shapes, and we're going to slope blur it. So this is our auto levels. So what I might do is just grab a slope blur, drop that in here. Like this. And then what I'm going to use, I'm going to use for the slope, I'm actually going to use a black and white spots. Okay, so if I plug this in here, add the samples, we can sort of see what's going on. Like we're getting this interesting sort of breakup here, which is nice. And you know, if we blur this off, the black and white spots, and we view this guy, you can sort of see the difference. So you know, you blur off those spots and you get a more sort of speckly pattern. So we don't want to do too much of that. We just probably want to blur it almost a little bit, like that. And you know, so this is our blood, and then this is going to represent our blood splatter. So what we can do is we can invert this so that those splatter points are white, and then we can just sort of clamp this down so that we have our splatter being a little bit more defined. And let's just see how we go using a gradient map to make that a little bit bloody. Okay, so we will select our levels, make a gradient map, and then we want our black stuff to, I guess we're going to be adding this over the top. We're probably going to be multiplying it. So for our black color here, we can make that white, and then for our white color here, we can sort of make that our blood color. And we'll have to play with this a little bit to get it to where we want it to be, but let's just see how we go. So add this here, we'll multiply that, and yes, that's adding in there. That's pretty nice. I actually think we probably want this to be a little bit brighter. Yeah, something like that. And then we probably also want to slope blur this a little bit more, to add a little bit more overlay on that blood as it comes up the sides of our pieces. And then we probably want to adjust this levels as well. Yeah, something like that. That's really disgusting. That's cool. Nice. So yeah, you can sort of see you're getting this like really gross, like little blood splattery pattern coming up from where those pools are. And you know, we could also add some noise into this splatter, just so it's not so sort of homogeneous all the way around. So what we could do here is we could add a black and white spots. We could make this pretty big, add some disorder, plug that into the alpha, and then we can kind of crunch this up, something like this. And we do want quite a bit of white, something like that. Maybe we scale this up and make it even more detailed, like that. Yeah, and then we're sort of, you're getting this nice kind of little bits of splashing happening in some areas but not in others. So that's pretty cool. So I'll just bring these nodes over, just drag everything out here, and I might just bring my normals down a little bit out of the way, and I'll just grab this, frame this, and I'll just call this blood spatter. So that's cool. Okay, so next thing I might do for this is to add some vein color, and this is going to play really nicely, especially on these sort of light areas of the flesh where we can see those veins. Like right now we can see them in the normal detail and the height detail, but we also want to see them in the color detail. So let's come over to our veins, and we're just going to hook up a gradient map to the output of these veins. And we want our veins to be sort of like a dark, like a purpley gray kind of color, and then the black we can just make this white. So that's our black, we'll turn that white, and then the white we'll grab like a off purpley sort of veiny color, something like that. And in actual fact, let's do a blend. Let's blend between purple veins and dark red veins. I think that'll read really nicely. So we'll make a purple one, and then we'll just we'll rotate this around to red, and we'll just saturate that a little bit more. And then what we'll do is we'll just blend these two together, and we'll use the copy node. But then what we'll do is we will break this up with, like a Perlin noise or something. Perlin noise, I'm sure, will do the trick. Disorder, chuck that in there. So yeah, you can kind of see that we're getting this sort of gross fading between slight purple, slight red, and I think that's going to work nice. So we'll just grab that setup. Bring that over here, and again we'll just blend this over the top, chuck that in our foreground, and then we just want to make this multiply. And now you can sort of see, you can really read those veins coming through in the color channel as well as the normal detail, and that looks like really, really gross, which is great. So this blend mode here, this is like a little bit extreme, so I'm just going to bring the opacity back ever so slightly, just so they're a little bit less opaque. But yeah, I think something like that is really great. Like that's definitely working. That's gross. Awesome. So I'll just save this. And then I think like our color is almost done. But the one final thing that would be great, if you look at this design, you can sort of see like we sort of have this natural shadowing going on in these pits here because they're quite deep and we've added them as a color. But you can sort of see that we have these little folds here, and they're not really shadowing at all. And we can actually add something in to do that. The easiest way is to just use like an ambient occlusion node on the final height. And then we can extract that ambient occlusion and map some colors to it, and then map that over the top of our base. So I'm just going to make an ambient occlusion HBAO node. And if I plug that into my height, what you'll see like straight away in the ambient occlusion is that you get these really nice like shadows around everything that has detail, which is great. Super, super handy. So we'll just bring this ambient occlusion all the way over here, and we'll make another blend node, plug that into the background, plug this in over here, and then we'll just plug this ambient occlusion into our foreground. And you can see we get this red pipe because this is a black and white image and we're trying to blend it into an RGB. So if we just make a gradient map, it works. And for this node here, we'll just set that to multiply. And then you can sort of see what that gives you, right? Like it gives you this like shadowing going on in these little gaps. But if we come back to our ambient occlusion node, what I might do is just reduce the radius a little bit so that we don't get as much shadowing in the larger areas. We just kind of keep it in some of our smaller areas like here, which is great. And the height depth is probably fine as it is. You can sort of see what happens the more you add, the more shadowing you sort of get. I think where it is was probably fine. And then, to gradient map this, we don't want to make this black because, we don't want black shadows in our flesh. We want like a red color. Maybe something like that. And you can sort of play around with how you want to map this over the top. Like there's lots of different modes that you can use that might work. We have the min darken, that might be kind of cool. What else do we have? Switch. We don't want to divide. You probably might actually need to use a matte if you want to use anything other than multiply, but it could work. And then maybe we can come back to our gradient here. You can play around with what you want. Like I actually don't mind sort of like a almost reddy color to give us like some of these shadows. And then maybe we can sort of add some extra height depth just to make those reds really come through a little bit more. So that's quite good actually. The other thing that you could do is you could also break this up. So again, your ambient occlusion is pretty smooth. So we could sort of break this up a little bit if we wanted to, so that it wasn't sort of such a smooth line like over here. And let's just give that a try. Like maybe that would sort of look interesting. I'll just use like a black and white spots 3, scale it up, disorder it, and if we plug that into our opacity, and we probably need to just crunch these values so that we get a much clearer matte. Yeah, so you can see what that's doing. It's like it's adding that ambient occlusion into those gaps, but it's sort of breaking up that pattern so that it's not just completely smooth. I know it's not a huge detail, but this sort of stuff goes a long way when you're creating shaders. So yeah, that's pretty cool. And we can also scale this up to make this pattern smaller and more detailed, which also can go a long way. Yeah, I think that's good. Awesome. Okay. So now that we've done that, I think probably the very last thing that I would do to our color is I would just add a whole bunch of just generic blood spatters to everything. So there's a number of ways that we can do that. I would probably just use a black and white spots and just scale it up. And I'd probably use like a blur node to create a little bit of a few like little blobs, and then we can grade that and we can turn it into a blood splatter pattern. So we just want like a little bit of blurring just to create some smooth like little dots, and then we can just add heaps of contrast into this. This, something along those lines. Yeah, something along those lines, just to add some interest. So we'll just come here, we'll blend, we'll add a gradient map here, and we'll leave the black as black, and we'll change the white to like a blood ready color. Not sure what color yet. We'll see how it looks when we blend it over the top of our base color. So we'll add that in, and again we'll just multiply that. Actually, sorry, I got those colors wrong. We want this black here because we're multiplying. We want that to be white. Yeah, something like that. And yeah, and there we go. There we just get some really, really gross blood splatters. You know, if we zoom in on those, we can sort of see that we're getting this blurriness, and that's because of the blur scale here. So if we take that back to like 0.2, we get a bit of a crispier blood pattern. I think something like that is totally fine. That's going to work. That blood color there, you could maybe get that just a tiny bit brighter if we have any room to do that. Yeah, maybe just like a little bit more red, just a little bit. Cool. That is looking thoroughly disgusting, which is exactly what we want. So nice one. All right. So yeah, I'd probably call the base color almost pretty much finished here. I mean, you know, you can just keep going with this to your heart's content, but I think like something like that is working. So I'll just put a frame here, and I'm just going to call this Ambox Shadow. Put a frame here, call this Blood Drops. And you know, that's pretty much it. And really all we need to do now is sort of define our roughness map. You know, at the moment we're just using the same roughness value for everything. So, you know, let's work on that. So the first thing I would basically do is grab my height information back here. And to make this like a little bit clearer, what I might just do is put a frame around this guy and just call this height final, just in case I ever need to come back into this node graph and do stuff. You know, I know that that's here, and this is my vein color. I didn't label that, so I'm just gonna do that here. Just call that vein color. And I'm going to take my height final, plug it into a levels node here, and then I'm going to come down and plug this into my roughness. Okay, now straight away you can sort of see that there are some problems, right? Because roughness essentially is black means super shiny and white means super rough and diffuse. So, you know, the blood here is great, like that's shiny, that's exactly what we want. But the tops of these blobs are like they almost look like paper, which is not what we want. We want this whole thing to be shiny, but we want the blood to be more shiny, and then we want this, like these little speckles of blood, to have a little bit of shine on top of them too. So for the levels, what we can do here is if we just push the high end of this down, you know, that's going to bring shine back to our flesh like that. And it's going to keep the blood stains, the blood pools at the bottom, like very, very shiny, which is great. I think the tops of these need to be a little bit smoother maybe. Something like that is probably okay. And what I would probably do here is start using some of the details that we created in our other passes and bring those details into our roughness map. So, you know, here we made this blood splatter, right? And the white represented that blood. So, you know, a cool thing to do would be to take that blood and bring it down into our roughness, so that these areas where we have that blood splatter, they stay shiny. So let's grab a levels node, and we'll flip this back around so that the blood marks are black. And then we'll just bring this down here, and we'll just blend this on top of our levels like this. and we'll just multiply that in. And you can sort of see what's happening as we do that. You know, like we have these sort of blood stains, and as we blend that roughness in, those areas where the blood stains are, they actually get, you know, shinier, which is great. And you'll really notice that when the light is moving across those areas. And if you raise this back up to be more rough on the top, you'll really see the difference between the shiny edges of that flesh and the kind of like smoother top areas. I think like that's probably a little bit much. You still want some shine here. But yeah, like that's great. And you're getting this nice kind of really gross sort of shininess going on down here in these recesses. So, you know, I would also do the same thing for these blood drops here that we made. So just grab levels and flip these values around. And then, you know, what I might do is just drag this roughness all the way over here. Make some dot nodes to reroute stuff. And bring this here. And again, just, you know, blend this roughness over the top. Make it multiply. And full opacity. So now, you know, like what we're getting is, you know, if we look here on these blood stains, as the light moves across the flesh, you're getting this like really reflective mark here. And maybe we don't make it full opaque, we just add like a little bit of shine, because these blood stains are so small and thin, they're not fully opaque, so some of the roughness underneath will come through. And yeah, like that's looking pretty reasonable. So I think we're in a pretty good spot here, actually. I mean, you know, you could keep adding noise into your roughness. You know, breaking up surfaces with roughness maps is a really great way of adding extra detail into your lighting. It really looks nice when you have reflections, and we can sort of play with having different reflection maps in Substance just to see how our material is responding. I always like to do this when I'm making different materials, just to make sure that I'm not catering too much to the HDRI in Substance, but I'm making something that is going to look good regardless of where it is. That is just really gross, which is awesome. You know, and then like we said before, like you can just keep coming back to your shapes that you made, and just keep playing around, and you know, you can just keep randomizing these nodes and just see what else you can come up with. And because you've already set up all the parameters, you know, everything that you do, all of the disorder and random seed values that you put into your noise maps will just give you completely different results. And you know, you might discover some things that you weren't expecting that look really cool. Awesome. So I'm going to save that, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to cut the video, and then we'll go over into Unreal Engine, and I can show you how this looks when I've added this to my little bits of flesh that get exploded out of my characters. Cool. See you in a sec. Alrighty, so here we are back in Unreal Engine. I've taken that material that we just made, and I've used it to texture some really simple little giblet pieces down here that I've got. And now I'm just gonna see how those look when we grab a gun and start blowing up people. Come over here and just smash this guy. Excellent. A whole bunch of pieces came out into the water. Very nice. That's looking thoroughly disgusting. Say goodbye to this guy. Excellent. And yeah, I think that pretty much does it. That's definitely a success. So yeah, hopefully that was helpful to some of you guys. And yeah, like I said, I'll keep doing some tutorials like this as I keep developing, and we'll keep it going. hopefully if I have time, and thanks for watching.